Hi guys, this is Daniel.
I'm Lucy.
And if you're here, well, most of you at least, it's because you want to know what fantasy is and what does someone who doesn't like fantasy think about it and why don't they like it, which is something interesting by itself. So most of the points I'm going to talk to you about and I want your opinions about actually comes from the comments, what people said.
A lot of people said a lot of things, yes.
And a lot of valid things as well. Before we get to that part, let me just talk a little bit about fantasy as a whole, as a genre, as a category of fiction.
Okay.
And I had someone who said in the comments that fiction as a whole could be considered fantasy because it's not real, it's not reality. But fiction usually it's described just as something that comes from the author's imagination.
Yeah, okay, I can agree with that, yeah.
And usually the difference is that fantasy, as a genre of fiction, contains unreal things that could never happen, creatures, magic, rules of physics that might be different, but those things might be real in the world where it's set. So that is the definition of fantasy. So, let's start. Now, in a more broader way, do you like fantasy?
Well, that's the whole point, I think, of the fact that I don't really like fantasy. It doesn't mean that I don't like any kind of fantasy. I might like some stuff, which I actually do, but I'm not just a big fan of unreal things like dragons, especially everything that's related with magic. I don't think I'm very into it, actually.
So in general, that's the reason why you don't like fantasy, because the magic aspect and the fact that it is quite unreal.
Exactly.
Right?
Also with the technology as well, for example.
If we talk about sci-fi, if it's
Yeah.
So maybe in sci-fi, if it's too different, if it's too alien to what we use nowadays, you find it also weird, or?
Yes. Yeah, I believe so. Yeah.
So, first thing that I have here is the idea that people who are more pragmatic often can connect with the fantasy genre. What do you think about this statement?
Well, I'm not sure if there's any study or anything to it, but I can 100% relate with that. I believe I'm a very pragmatic person. I'm a very, very logical person. It can be one of the reasons. I don't know if every person that doesn't like fantasy is like that, but I can really relate with that, actually.
Okay, so as a rule, you think that this might have some truth behind it?
I believe so, yeah. I mean, I think it kind of makes sense.
The second one I have here is that the idea that if you aren't exposed to it, to fantasy, since an early age, also it's more difficult to connect. Do you agree or disagree?
Again, I think I have to agree with that one. Since I was a kid, my parents, they're not a big fan of fantasy movies as well, so I was never very exposed to that kind of genre of movies. But actually, I always saw when I was younger, like crime, thrillers, dramas, also true stories. It's something that I love. If you grew up with that kind of things like Harry Potter's vibe or Lord of the Rings or Star Wars, I believe you're more into it to like when you grow up, actually.
Do you think this idea of you growing up with it makes you connect more? Do you think matters more than the other one? People who are more pragmatic find it more difficult to connect? Do you think it matters more or less, for example?
I would say more, if that's what
more?
You're asking. Because imagine, when you were younger, it's way easier for you to connect with magic stuff because you're a kid. You have a lot more of imagination. You still don't have like the adult life that you need to worry about. So you have the freedom to think whatever you want. And I think that it might be more related with the fact that you're not exposed to that when you're a kid than the fact of being more pragmatic. Still, I think it's very tight, but yeah.
Fantasy is not real and never will be real. That's the point of fantasy. Do you feel there is nothing to be gained by losing yourself for a few hours in something that is not real?
Oh, of course not. I wish I could love it. I wish I loved it. I wish I was a big fan. You seem very surprised. Or
A little bit. Okay.
No, I think. What was the question? I got lost.
No, the idea was that if you thought that it was like a waste of time, like there's nothing to be gained.
No. I think that we can also gain something. For example, with Lord of the Rings, the fellowship, let's say, that they have, the strength that they have. I think you always learn something. I wasn't in love with it, but it doesn't mean that I don't appreciate the value that it gives to someone that's watching, of course.
I was kind of expecting you for you to say like, oh, I don't think there's much to be gained from that. So the next point is kind of pointless because I was gonna say, oh, what about escapism, entertainment? You can get that from fantasy.
I think that if you see a movie, fantasy or not, sci-fi or not, true story, whatever it is, if it doesn't give you something back, even if it's just like the pleasure of watching it, or like the feeling, the connection with the characters, the fact of you thinking about something that happened in your life, if it doesn't connect you somehow, and also you don't get anything with it, that's exactly, in my opinion, a bad movie. Despite of me not enjoying, for example, Lord of the Rings, it doesn't make me not appreciate the movie, and I still believe that I gained a lot from watching it.
I know we already touched on this, but if you want to delve a little bit more on the subject, first of all, what are your favorite movie genres? And second of all, how much have you been exposed to fantasy? Not just movies, but the idea of fantasy in general, since you were a kid.
Okay, so my favorite genres, and this is something that people ask a lot as well in the comments, I think it's really the crime, especially true crime. I'm very passionate,
Maybe.
yeah, about crime. My education, it's a lot about, or a little bit about crime, and that's something that for me has like a huge, I can have a huge perspective of it. Drama, I really love a good drama, especially if it is like war related. Like romantic dramas are not really my thing. Very commercial stuff like comedy, like comédia romântica.
Yeah, romantic comedy.
Yeah. That's not really my thing. Christmas movies either.
No, what you like, it's I know, it's
I like
dark comedies. That's
Oh, I was forgetting. Yeah, I am a very dark comedy movie kind of person. The darker, the best. And some people might consider that it's lack of respect or lack of intelligence or lack of something, which the something I kind of agree, but well, I don't know. I just think that when you're able in even a dark situation to see the magic of stuff and the great side of it, I think that's when magic happens, and I really like that kind of things.
I really like dark comedy as well, and I think it comes a little bit from that, the thing that finding the humor in the darkest aspects of humanity. And I think it helps you.
Yeah, and that's the only way that you can get through stuff. For example, Saving Private Ryan. It's the movie that just went out in our channel, so make sure to watch it.
Go watch the video. Yes, please.
Let's redo. In the very in the beginning, I laugh when someone got shot in the heart. Of course, that's a very sad thing, and I do respect a lot what everyone went through in the war. I think everyone does.
For example, a little bit with the guy who got shot in the heart in the beginning, but also with the guy who got shot in the head when he removed the helmet. Even though he would have died, even if he had the helmet. It is I consider it comedic moments. Comedic why? Because it shows the absolute darkness of war, the absurdity of war.
Yes,
that's why it is. You kind of have to laugh, like almost like a device for you to handle it.
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
It's like you're watching something that you don't want to believe it existed, but the truth is that a lot of people died in war, in my opinion. If you cannot see things that way, if you just get, I cannot see, well, that's not a solution. You're not facing things, and you can still feel how heavy sometimes some scenes are. Not just Saving Private Ryan, but any kind of movie about war and crime. For example, Dahmer, a true...
The Netflix show.
Yeah, the Netflix show. Even there, that's a guy completely insane that killed 17 boys. Even in that show, you can see some moments of comedy.
Of course.
And they do it on purpose. The thing is, not everyone is dark comedy related, let's say.
Because I would say you can have two ways of looking at, even in the Dahmer show or in Saving Private Ryan, you can have shock, you can be shocked, which is a perfectly normal response.
And I totally understand and respect.
Yes, if you are more fucked up in the head like maybe we laugh. You know what I mean?
Yeah, but the thing is, why people find it so strange, you know?
How much have you been exposed to fantasy?
I don't think I have been exposed to fantasy at all. So, for example, I've never seen Harry Potter, Lord of the Rings, Star Wars.
Without counting movies, what about like folk stories that include like, you know, like you might have like wizards or maybe fairies, stuff like that?
I was never that kind of person, or kids.
Or your family didn't.
Yeah. Even Disney movies.
For me, it was a big part of me growing up. It was the Disney movies, obviously.
But you consider that fantasy? Totally.
Of course.
I was never in love with those kind of stories. I think that I never saw the Lion King.
Oh meu Deus.
Is it Lion King?
Yeah.
Oh no, I was.
I'm
There
so
was
shocked.
a movie. There was a movie that I loved, Mulan. I think that's the only movie of fantasy, let's say, that I actually enjoyed and watched. But again, it's the story. It's about a woman that does everything for the family. She's turned into a war person.
Yeah, and in a way, so the story maybe was more familiar to you, and because of the story, you were able to accept the dragon,
to connect,
the stuff like that appear.
Yeah.
Okay, Lion King actually was was the first movie I ever saw on cinema.
That's sad.
I think I was 4 when it came out.
Yeah, the only thing that I hear about Lion King is that everyone cries. So I think, well, I could watch it now that I'm a grown person, kind of, but I don't wanna. I think you guys don't think so, but I think I'm very sensitive.
No, but you are
person.
insensitive.
Oh,
you are.
sorry.
This one we're gonna delve a little bit more into sci-fi.
Okay.
Because sci-fi is kind of a technological fantasy, in a way.
Yeah.
So do you think you are more likely to get immersed in a science fiction story rather than a fantasy-based one because of that?
I'm not sure I can answer that, because if I cannot connect with fantasy, I truly cannot connect with sci-fi. Sorry, I always say sci-fi. I know how it's said, but it just...
Some
habit.
sci-fi, yes.
Yeah. For example, Dune. I didn't really like it, and I think it's more like sci-fi. In the other hand, Guardians of the Galaxy, it's one of my favorite movies. Not because it has a very high quality or anything, because it's not. It's a very funny and has a lot of comedy. And once again, I think it has a little bit of dark humor, so that's why I'm kind of connect to it. But honestly, I think I like sci-fi or fantasy if he has a touch of comedy.
That's interesting, because I was gonna start talking about something that I know you kind of like.
Superheroes.
Most of those movies. I know some of them you don't, but you like some of them, and they usually have a lot of fantasy and sci-fi elements to them.
It doesn't mean I think they are high quality, but yeah, I like them.
In general, I would say that maybe people are more acceptant of sci-fi rather than fantasy, maybe because they see that technology or magic technology might have a possibility to become a reality in the future.
Yeah.
Do you agree with that idea, for example?
Totally, yeah. I think that for me it's way easier to enjoy a sci-fi movie, because I believe that in future, everything's gonna happen. We see now the technology, the speed that it goes, and that it gets developed.
Another idea. People who cannot appreciate fantasy don't have an imagination.
I cannot agree with that. Actually, one of my works, it's working with design. We do like handicrafts in wood, that kind of stuff. And you need to have imagination to do that. But it's something that's a very practical imagination, let's put it that way. But yeah, I want to say something like that. So if you tell me, do you have imagination to write stories or do you dream a lot? No, not at all.
What if I say not like they don't have imagination, but someone who doesn't like fantasy, do you think they have less imagination?
I don't think it's much related. It can have a little like thing, but I don't think that's the main point, the main thing.
Is it possible for you to like a story that has fantasy elements?
Of course. I think so. For example,
any examples exactly?
if we get like Lord of the Rings, for example, right? So I'm not a big fan of the movie itself because it's very dramatic and very theatrical in my opinion.
Melodramatic. I think that's what you want to say.
That it's very melodramatic. Those speeches and all of that, it's not really my thing, and I think that's the reason why I don't like it as much. But despite of all, what everyone wants to hear and what's the truth is that I quite enjoy it, you know? Despite of everything, I enjoy it, you know? Of course, it's not my favorite thing, but of course, we can enjoy stuff that we don't like.
That's a very interesting sentence. We can enjoy things we don't like.
Yeah, no, it's true.
Now, to finish this, I want to discuss a little bit high and low fantasy. I found that the difference between high and low fantasy can be measured in two different ways.
Okay, let's hear.
First of all is the setting. High fantasy has to be set in a completely different world from our own. So it includes languages, geography, people that don't exist in reality. Okay. And that's called high fantasy. Lord of the Rings makes part of it. For example, yeah. And that low fantasy has to be set in our world with fantasy elements thrown into it. That would be Harry Potter, for example. You haven't seen it, but it would be Harry Potter, for example. I
would say also, for example, the Game of Thrones.
Game of Thrones is not set in our world.
But it's different, you know. They only have dragons. That's different.
You're getting into my second point, which is another way to measure this, with magic. And this one, I agree more with this one than the other, even though I agree with the setting one as well. So, when you look at, from the standpoint of magic, high fantasy, it's a genre that has a lot of magic, and with its own rules, and magic is common and flashy, and all of that. And that low fantasy, it's the opposite. Not so much, following most of the real world rules of physics.
I would agree more with that. For example, not Lord of the Rings, the Game of Thrones. It would go more to that path.
For example, I adhere more to this idea. So in this case, magic in this genre is something that is more rare, more subtle, more mysterious. It exists, but in a much lower. Subtle. Yeah, and for example, because before we saw Lord of the Rings, I think the only fantasy thing that you were exposed to was Game of Thrones.
Which I loved it, by the way. Okay. Yeah.
And my idea, I'm not sure, is that you would probably be much more comfortable with low fantasy if we see from this perspective of magic.
Magic is totally my problem, I would say.
Yeah, to get immersed into.
Yeah, I think so, because that's the thing. I don't believe in magic and any of it. And I think that the fact that I don't believe it, it makes me like, oh, I'm watching it, but it's not real, you know? And with Game of Thrones, of course I know it's not real, but it's like, well, it's not real, but the only extra thing they have is like the dragons. You don't have much more fantasy.
You have some magic that appears, obviously, but it's very, very rare. It's mysterious. It's not really explained. You have the others. You have the dragons. You have some spells that appear, like with how is she called, the Melisandre, the Red Priestess. Yeah. She does some stuff.
But the thing is, it's exactly the same that you had in real life. If you go like 500 years ago, that's what you had. Witches were burned. People with black cats were burned because it was like the idea of magic, especially dark magic.
The unknown.
Exactly. So I think it's a little bit too in that thing because it existed before. I'm not saying I believe it, but it was in our culture, let's say. Mm-hmm. even nowadays, a lot of people just sometimes say, "Oh, I'm going to the witch because I have something that I cannot deal with," or the people that read the hands, for example.
Yeah, I mean, in our country, yeah, a lot of people are like, "Oh, okay, I'm gonna go to
in
the
our
witch."
country. Yeah, I don't know about you guys, but that's also considered, in my opinion, it slightly touches the magic point, you know?
I understand, yeah.
And for example, in Game of Thrones, I think that's exactly the amount, let's say, of magic that they have, in my opinion. I love it because of the politics. I put my phone in silent.
For me, for example, since we're on this subject, I like both fantasy, obviously. I like high or low fantasy.
You like everything.
But ultimately, I do think I have a slight preference for low fantasy.
Yeah.
It can be set in a completely different world. But I like that magic be something more mysterious, more subtle. I don't like as much when magic is something that you know all about, you know, and it's flashy and everything. There are exceptions. For example, in the books of the Wheel of Time, magic it's very well explained how it works, so it's very high fantasy in that aspect, but I really like the books, so in that case.
But maybe because I think that the main thing of the books is also, the main plot, let's say, it's also about magic, no?
Yes, and it's explained very, very well, and you understand it, so since the beginning you understand exactly how that works, so it's great.
Yeah, because in high fantasy I think that the problem is that some things just exist. You are presented to the movie or to the world as something that has always been like that. The thing is, you can understand how it works with low fantasy because it's similar to your world, you know, to our world. But when you talk about high fantasy, I think it's way harder for you to be able to do the connection because you don't understand how the world itself was created, how things work, what's the logic behind it, you know, because I think that the problem is that we see it as something that just exists and it's there. Why? Because it's how it works.
I agree that a lot of times that happens in high fantasy. A lot of times, not always, because some cases things are very well explained. For example, in the Lord of the Rings, there's a difference here. It's just that the books, it's something quite different. And yes, in the books, it's you have a whole mythology and you understand how that universe exists, right? But it's different. That's the books.
I understand it's in a different world and all of it, but if you don't read the books, actually, you have no way to know it, you know? The books, they are essential. And I understand you cannot put a book into a movie. Of course not. It's not supposed to. That's not how it works. If you're like me and you don't actually read a lot, that kind of fantasy books, you cannot understand. And I felt very lost sometimes during the movie, The Lord of the Rings, because that's the only, I think that's the only example that I have that I can give an example of. I felt very lost sometimes because of it. Not because I don't understand the movie itself, but because some small things, small connections that they were just there, and I was, why is it like this or like that? And then you explain me after some of the stuff, some of the things, and I could understand, but because you read the books and you were explaining me, you know.
That's why sometimes I also like the TV show format that we have coming up with a lot of things. I'm not talking about Rings of Power, okay? That's something that you don't know, but that has nothing to do with that.
Yeah.
But for example, with Game of Thrones, I was glad it was made into a TV show, not movies, because it gives you time you need to connect
with the world, with how it works, and also with the characters. You need the development of the characters in order for you to be able to connect and understand their point of view as well.
I would say that the problem I have with Game of Thrones has more to do with
the way it ended.
The way things developed. Because in the end, in a way, it becomes a little bit more high fantasy as well. Yeah. But my problem is not exactly with that. It's really with
the
characters and the script. At the same time, I understand from the point of view that the first seasons were almost direct copies from the books. Yeah. So I understand.
And once again, we go back to the same. The books are essential for a TV show or a movie to have quality, if the books are high quality. And you said that Lord of the Rings are very high quality, the books. And also, for example, now the TV show, the House of the Dragon, I think it's following the same direction.
Yeah, they have an advantage because the story that the House of the Dragon is telling, it's written, it's finished. Okay?
Yeah.
It's not written the same way as A Song of Ice and Fire is written, obviously, but the story is there. So they just need to find good writers and find the dialogues and stuff like that, and the little drama and stuff like that. But the story itself, it's set.
Yeah,
you know?
Yeah, we've seen, and you said that something's changed. We already saw the first season.
Yes, there's some
slightly, yeah,
minor things. One of them is not so minor, but the rest I think it's quite minor.
Yeah, we're not going to give you any kind of spoilers, but
Yeah,
for example, I didn't read the books. Daniel did, and then we were watching, and it was like, oh, in books it's completely different. This part it happened this and that, and it's actually funny to see sometimes how even this part of a story being completely written, like we're saying, even though people can, have the imagination to create different things and still works.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, the books are very important for people to get inspired, but doesn't mean that you cannot follow a different path.
No,
sometimes.
But ultimately, it's a different medium. It's
Yeah.
a different art form. Films and TV shows. It's a different art than books. It cannot
Yeah.
be the same, anyways. So.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's my opinion. Nothing can replace books. So. Just to conclude, the main reasons you don't like fantasy are...
I would say the magic, high fantasy, let's put it that way.
Mm-hmm.
Also because I think I was never very exposed to that kind of genre movies, so I'm much more logical person, rational person, and I think that's one of the big
Are you
reasons
calling
as
us
well.
irrational?
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm saying, so please put that in the comments and be aggressive and haters with me, because that's exactly what I say. Said God, and then they're gonna say that I don't know how to talk. God. I don't know, but yeah, I think that's the main reasons. Also because my kind of movie is exactly the opposite. Crime and true stories, crime and
crime.
And crime and war. I love war as well. And dark comedy. So yeah, not everyone likes to eat the same thing the same way as not everyone likes to watch the same thing, and not everyone watches in the same way.
Well guys, here you have it. Why some people might not enjoy fantasy, but at least this is my opinion. And like you said, you might like some things that have fantasy elements.
Yeah.
She did like Game of Thrones, after all. So I'm gonna expose you still to a lot more fantasy stuff.
I'm not sure if I'm happy or not with it.
No, I'm gonna. You know what I'm gonna do? First of all, I'm gonna show you a movie that is low fantasy.
I think I'm gonna enjoy a little bit more.
Okay. And then I will show you something that I consider high fantasy, so people might not consider it.
Okay.
But it's gonna be quite big.
Oh god, you're talking about Harry Potter.
Yeah.
Oh god, please help me.
No, but I think you might enjoy it.
Despite of not enjoying sci-fi or fantasy, the best part is that we watch it together and we're having a great time doing these videos for you guys. And what matters, especially with movies and all of it, is that it connects people.
Yeah.
You can connect with the stories and all of it, and at the end of the day, that's what matters. So yeah.
Right, guys. See you next time.
See ya.
Hey guys, please let us know your thoughts about why you think someone wouldn't enjoy fantasy. And please let us know if you are more of a high or low fantasy kind of person. So, next up will be the Green Mile and the Harry Potter saga, but please let us know of more recommendations. In the beginning of the next year, I will try to set up Patreon accounts and use the system of polls, I think it's how it's called, so I can have a more democratic way of choosing which movies to expose next. Take care and follow us for more. Thanks.